Hi and welcome back to Heimlich's History. Now in the last video we began Unit 6 by talking about the rationales and the motivations for imperialism between 1750 and 1900. In this video we're going to look at the imperial expansion itself into Africa and into Asia, so if you're ready, I'm ready, let's get to it. So let's begin by defining the thing. Imperialism is when a country extends its power and influence into other lands, sometimes by diplomacy and sometimes by force. And now that we've got it defined, let's look at the imperial expansion into Africa and China. First, Africa. Now if you've been paying attention since Unit 4, you'll remember that Europe had been expanding its influence into Africa since the 1800s. However, for much of the 19th century, European influence in Africa was restricted to trading posts. But by the late 1800s, Europeans began to desire more than that. And why? Well, you know why.
Daddy's hungry!
And here's how they got what they wanted. Let's start with the British. One of their chief desires during this period, and they were certainly not alone in this, was a shorter sea-based route to Asian trading posts. Because hey, this is the Industrial Revolution, baby. We got raw materials to import and manufactured goods to export, and ain't nobody got time to sail all the way around Africa. And so they began to look with hungry eyes at building a canal across Egypt to connect the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. And so in 1869, the Suez Canal was completed and that dream became a reality. But by 1882, because of unrest in the region, Britain got a little twitchy about its interests in the canal and went ahead and seized control of it from the Ottomans. Now on the other side of Africa, Britain already had some colonies, but they desired more. In those existing colonies, Britain had entered into diplomatic agreements with the African leaders that were in general favorable to both sides. But when the imperialistic fervor for Africa began to heat up, the British tossed those agreements out the window and began taking over by force. And they did this because Africans were being so rude as to resist their imperial influence. And by these means they established colonial holdings in Sierra Leone, Gambia, Lagos, and the Gold Coast. And the French operated similarly in West Africa. France ousted the Ottomans from Algeria in 1830 and they established there a settler colony. Now remember, a settler colony is one in which people from the imperial country actually relocate to that place in order to live there. And so as a result of that, you have a huge influx of French and Spanish and Italian immigrants coming to live in Algeria. Now, so far I've just been hinting at it, but now let's bring the whole of the imperialistic fervor for Africa into the light. It became known as the Scramble for Africa. So as more and more lands were claimed by European powers in Africa, competition for said claiming began to heat up. And because the Europeans began fighting over Africa like children fighting over a toy in a sandbox, some people were wise enough to see that all this land grabbing was going to cause a war. And one such person was Otto von Bismarck of Germany. And so he decided to call the Berlin Conference in 1884. And at this meeting, imperial leaders would decide how to carve up Africa in a way that pleased everyone and avoided war. And in doing so, they drew colonial boundaries according to their own pleasure. And this became a real problem because they drew boundaries that divided long-united Africans and combined long-standing rival groups. And that would cause them endless trouble and unrest in the future. But you know what? That can't be their fault. Why didn't the Africans at the conference speak up and offer their wisdom? Come again? The Europeans didn't invite any Africans to the Berlin Conference? Well, that was stupid. Regardless, by 1875, Western European nations were set and poised to push into the interior of Africa to establish colonies. And it was our Belgian friends who began this effort, but they did it in kind of a strange way. The Belgian king, Leopold II, pushed into the Congo and claimed it as his own personal holding, which is to say, not a colony of his state. And as the sole owner of this colony, Leopold grew extraordinarily rich, but don't worry, he gained his wealth in a completely humane and dignified way. Yeah, right. No, Leopold profited by enacting policies of brutality towards the Congolese. He used forced labor to extract ivory and rubber from the land, and under his brutal policies, over 8 million people died. However, by 1908, the Belgian state took over this colony, and conditions improved somewhat. Okay, there's way more to say about the scramble for Africa, but that will have to suffice for illustrative purposes. Now let's shift our attention to the imperialistic push into Asia, and we'll begin with the British presence in India. So, under the auspices of the British East India Company, Britain, over time, began to claim more and more territory from the weakened Mughal Empire. And eventually they went ahead and conquered all of India. Now, how did they do that? Well, they started by using their own troops, but as the campaign grew, they recruited Indian soldiers called sepoys to join their effort. And later that's going to turn into a big mistake, but we'll have to save that story for another video. Okay, what about China? In China, European powers exercised a different kind of imperialism, namely economic imperialism. Now, during this time, China was experiencing a period of instability due to natural disasters and internal rebellion. And so Western powers moved in to help stabilize China and get them back on their feet because everybody benefits from a strong China. not. No, the Western powers were like sharks that smell blood in the water and then pounces on a weakened China in order to chew its face off. They flexed their military might and demanded trading rights with China, and China had little choice but to agree. And so the result of this endeavor was that Western powers carved up China into what's called spheres of influence. The Qing dynasty remained in power, but these Western powers had exclusive trading rights in their own sphere. And since we're in Asia, let's talk about Japan. Japan was not in fact colonized during this time, but became a colonizer. As you may remember, they modernized their military during a period of reform called the Meiji Restoration, and once they became powerful, they started looking around for other peoples that they could crush like grapes between their powerful thighs. And chief among their desires was colonial holdings rich in raw materials. And so Japan's imperial expansion eventually included Korea, holdings in Southeast Asia, and some Pacific islands and parts of China. But Japan wasn't the only power to expand into Southeast Asia. The Dutch got on that too. The Dutch East India Company established dominance in some of these places, but due to corruption in the company itself, they eventually failed. And so once that failure was complete, the Dutch government stepped in and took all of those colonial holdings for themselves. Alright, how about Australia and New Zealand? Well, the British colonized both. Australia was established as a penal colony, which is to say that that's where Britain sent all of its convicts. They sent their first convicts there in 1788 in a few contained locations, but by the 1820s, the British had conquered the whole dang continent. But when they discovered that Australia's climate was well suited for the production of wool, and once they had discovered copper and gold below the surface, many non-criminals arrived and it became a proper colony. New Zealand, on the other hand, was established as a settler colony. And this was a little tricky because the islands were already inhabited by the Maori people. And so in their boundless benevolence, the British created a separate colony for the Maori and told them to go live there. And I don't even have to tell you the rest of the story. You know the rest of the story. Europeans be Europeans. You cannot stop a European from being a European. They simply could not help themselves from encroaching on the Maori land, and so a war broke out between the British and the Maori. The Maori were the losers in the New Zealand wars, and that caused a deep and abiding resentment in them towards their colonizers. Alright, now let's hop over the Pacific Ocean and see how the United States is getting their imperialistic itch scratched. The first wave of expansion for the United States was on their own continent. Deep inside the American identity was an urge to push westward, and they did so until they conquered the whole of the territory from sea to shining sea. Now, of course, the western lands weren't uninhabited. The natives who lived there from time immemorial, though they resisted the American expansion, were the losers of that conflict. For example, in 1830, the American Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which led to the systematic removal of American Indians from the east onto reservations in the Midwest. This migration was along what became known as the Trail of Tears because of the abuse and death the Indians experienced as they made the trek. All of this was the result of what Americans believed to be their manifest destiny. In their minds, Providence had given them the rights to all of this land, and it was theirs, therefore, to take it. Now, once the Americans finally possessed a nation from sea to shining sea, that impulse for expansion didn't just die away. If being part of the Cool Kids Club meant gaining overseas empires, then the will to expand could in no wise cease. And so in the late part of the 19th century, America gathered for itself an overseas empire. Chief among these efforts was the Spanish-American War in 1898. The Americans declared war on Spain with some trumped-up charges, went to war, and ended up winning a lot of territory, including the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And not to miss out on all this fun, Russia jumped into the imperialistic expansion game as well. Catherine II expanded the Russian Empire thusly. She won half of Poland from the Ottomans, and later Alexander I annexed Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, Finland, and part of Armenia. And even later, Russia acquired a large portion of Manchuria from China. Alright, that's what you need to know about Unit 6, Topic 2 of AP World History. If you found this helpful, then subscribe and I'll keep making videos for you. If you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam, then check out my AP World History Ultimate Review Packet. It's got everything you need to succeed in this class, including more videos from me that are not here on YouTube. So if that's something you're interested in, then get your clicky finger out and click right here. Heimler out.